personae on the front benches. And to ask his urgent question, John Healey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. To ask the Secretary of State for Defence to make a statement on the state of the UK Armed Forces.
Minister.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it is an honour to be able to stand up and set out how our outstanding armed forces are doing incredible work around the world, protecting the UK and our allies. This includes operating on every single NATO mission, supporting Ukraine against Putin's aggression, and tackling Houthi attacks on shipping in the Red Sea. We are spending a record amount on defence. This includes an extra £24 billion in cash terms between 2020 to 2025, the largest sustained increase since the end of the Cold War. The government fully recognises the growing security threat, which is why we have set out our longer-term aspiration to invest 2.5% of GDP on defence when the fiscal and economic circumstances allow. We are already spending more than 2% of GDP on defence, exceeding our NATO target. We are delivering the capabilities our forces need, significantly increasing spending on defence equipment to £288.6 billion over the next decade and introducing a new procurement model to improve acquisition. For the Royal Navy, this includes Dreadnought, Astute and AUKUS submarines, as well as Fleet Solid Support Ships Type 26 and Type 21 frigates. For the Army, the Future Soldier will deliver the largest transformation in more than 20 years, re-equipping and reorganising to be more deployable and lethal. And the RAF will become an increasingly digitally empowered force, with GCAP providing a 6th-generation fighter jet capability, building upon that provided by our Typhoons and F-35 5th-generation aircraft today. Our Defence Command Plan 2023 set out our plan to deliver a credible warfighting force, generated and employed to protect the nation and help it prosper now and in the years to come. We will embody a fully integrated approach to deterrence and defence, including across all domains, across government, by exploiting all the levers of state power and with allies and partners.
John Healey.
Madam Deputy Speaker, first I want to pay tribute to HMS Richmond's actions over the weekend, defending shipping in the Red Sea against a large-scale Houthi attack. These are the demands our armed forces face as threats increase. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Defence Secretary owes the public and Parliament an explanation. He said we're moving into a pre-war world, and ahead of last week's budget, he wrote to the Chancellor, and I quote, "We must take bold action in your budget to commit to defence spending increasing to 2.5% in 2024. It would re-establish our leadership in Europe." But there is a growing gap between the Defence Secretary's rhetoric and the reality for our armed forces that are charged with preparing for this new dangerous era. In the budget, there was no new money for defence, nothing new for Ukraine, nothing for Gaza or the UK's operations in the Middle East. And worse, both the Treasury and the House of Commons Library confirm the defence budget will be cut £2.5 billion in cash terms in this next financial year. Madam Deputy Speaker, 2.5% of GDP, as the Minister said, wasn't mentioned once in the Treasury Red Book, and the last time this country spent 2.5% of GDP on defence was in 2010 under a Labour government. Madam Deputy Speaker, while Putin wages war in Europe, ministers are warring with each other, challenging defence policy in public. The Security Minister on TV this morning calling for 2.5% now. Madam Deputy Speaker, while this is a serious breakdown in collective ministerial responsibility, I am most concerned about the serious state of the UK Armed Forces. What signal does it send to our adversaries when our forces have been hollowed out and underfunded for the last 14 years, when the Public Accounts Committee finds the largest ever funding deficit in the MOD's equipment plans, when the British Army has been cut to its smallest size since Napoleon, when forces recruitment targets have been missed each and every year for 14 years, and when satisfaction with service life has hit a record low. So I have one simple question for the Minister. Where is the plan for better defending Britain? Because it's clear our armed forces can't afford another 5 years of Conservative government.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And may I say to the honourable gentleman that I'm very grateful for his comments in respect of HMS Richmond. I'm sure we all agree and pay tribute to our Royal Navy personnel. Of course, they are there ultimately defending themselves, but also freedom of navigation for the rest of the world. And we should recognise the importance of that role that they are undertaking on behalf of our government. He talked about the funding for next year. To be clear, it will represent a 1.8% increase in real terms, not the cut that he suggested. That is a total, if we spend the money that we expect, it will amount to £55.6 billion, Madam Speaker. That's about 2.3% of GDP, which is traditionally how we've been measuring our spending. That is significantly above the just under 2.1% in 2019, so it is a significant increase as a percentage of GDP. He talks about recruitment, and it is an important issue. What I would say is my honourable friend is doing a lot of work on this, and he'll be aware that in January we saw the highest number of applications to the Army, for example, for 6 years. So a more positive picture developing there, recognising the importance of the mission. So we shouldn't talk down our armed forces when we expect people to apply and want to be recruited into them. On the particular point about the 2.5%, and I note the range of comments on this, I would make several points. The first is, he said, we haven't spent that since they were in power. Well, something extraordinary happened at the end of their time in power, which was they crashed the economy, we had a full-on banking crisis, and a letter was left for our government saying there's no money left. So no surprises that we had to take difficult decisions, but nevertheless, and despite that, we have shown our commitment to the armed forces, the Prime Minister approving, when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, the largest ever increase in defence spending since the Cold War, further money since then in the budget. Of course, we are committed to 2.5% when the circumstances allow. But for all the honourable gentleman's bluster, he hasn't even committed to matching our current spending on defence, let alone 2.5%. We challenged him on this at defence orals. He wasn't able to give any commitment whatsoever to spending. So the public know where we stand. 2.3% in the year ahead, 2.5% when the economics allow. We don't have a clue where they stand.
Sir Jeremy Quin.
Deputy Speaker, I agree with the Minister. We have extraordinarily capable armed forces, and they are also, their productivity is second to none. However, as set out in our committee report, Ready for War, they are extremely engaged globally. They have a great deal to do, much of which is invaluable. And at the same time, they're having to prepare for the pre-war phase, which his right honourable friend has referred to. In that context, would my honourable friend not agree that the 2.5% target, which is very welcome, it's a very good first step, that needs the timing of that needs to be determined by the level of threat as a priority expenditure rather than as economic conditions allow?
Well, I don't think we can commit to levels of public expenditure or, for example, tax cuts without being confident the economy can support them in a prudent fashion. I think that's an entirely reasonable and rational approach to take. But I totally agree with my right honourable friend, the chair of the Select Committee, about the importance. I think we all recognise we are living in a more dangerous world. The Secretary of State was alluding to the threats that we face, not just in Ukraine, but in respect of other adversaries around the world. And what I would say is, I totally understand why there is the wider debate on what we spend, but we do have a significant budget already, and we have to ensure it is spent well and delivers value for money, which is why, for me, Madam Deputy Speaker, a key priority here is reform of our procurement system so that we can ensure that our armed forces are able to prioritise effectively, because it's the capability we have and have now which will ultimately determine our ability to warfight.
SNP spokesman. Martin Docherty-Hughes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and let me congratulate the Shadow Defence Secretary for gaining the UQ and join him and the Minister in remembering those on HMS Richmond. Now, the Public Accounts Committee on Friday's publication, and to quote, found the MOD is increasingly reliant on the UK's allies to protect our national interests. NATO membership deters hostility, but the report warns such deterrence can only be effective if our armed forces are credible. And to paraphrase the report, Madam Deputy Speaker, given that many of our allies face similar capability challenges, I wonder if the Minister could advise, is the Ministry of Defence developing mitigations for how to deal with the risk of Allied support being curtailed or withdrawn critically, if there's a change of administration in Washington come November?
Well, to be fair to the Honourable General, he does make an important point about the importance of alliances. NATO is fundamental to the defence of our country and to the wider Western world and our allies beyond. And what I would say critically, if we want to put in context, when we talk about the state of the armed forces, which is what this UQ is about, and in terms of the alliances that the SNP spokesman refers to, just remember, we have just launched one of the largest ever NATO exercises, Steadfast Defender. There are 96,000 personnel involved, Madam Deputy Speaker, of which almost 20,000 are from the UK, and I believe we make up 40% of the land forces. That is an extraordinary contribution by the UK. We offer our nuclear deterrent to NATO. We are supporting our allies. We stand together under Article 5, and we should all do everything possible to support NATO in its 75th anniversary year.
Sir Julian Lewis.
May I commend to anyone interested in the historical context a report produced by the Defence Select Committee in July 2019, HC 2527, called Shifting the Goalposts and Update, which shows that for the last 20 years of the Cold War, this country spent between 5.6 and 4.1% of GDP calculated as in the same way that we do today as a proportion on defence. And does that not show both sides of the House that we have an awful long way to go now there's a hot war in Europe before we match what we used to do when there was a Cold War in Europe?
Well done.
Well, I have to say to my right friend, he does put that very eloquently, and of course he speaks with great passion and expertise on the Cold War and our recent modern history. What I would say to him is, I mean, he knows this, of course, in the Cold War era, we had a working assumption of an invasion that could be, or certainly confrontation that could be launched on the border in Germany very quickly. We had huge forces deployed, and understandably, given the threat, we had a higher percentage of GDP on defence. Now, since then, we thought we had a more peaceful era. Those illusions have been shattered by Putin. We've all had to wake up to that, which is why we've done so much to support Ukraine, and yes, why we'll do everything possible to support our armed forces.
Emmanuel Buck.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State said he wanted to ensure our entire defence ecosystem is ready to defend. But here's the reality of our armed forces under this government. Capability delays and shortfalls, stockpile shortages, losing personnel, woeful recruitment levels, a £29 billion black hole in finances, and as of last week, no real boost to the MOD's budget. The Secretary of State is failing, isn't he?
Well, when the Honourable Lady talks about procurement and delays, I would have thought she could at least recognise that if we look at the support we've given to Ukraine, we have procured an extraordinary amount of ordnance into the country to help them defend themselves, and much of it at great pace, not least from gifting, for example, RAS-90s, a whole range of munitions, 300,000 artillery shells. And if it hadn't been for the role of this country, I think we can safely say Russia would have been successful.
Tobias Elwood.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Whether it be COVID or war in Ukraine or indeed the Middle East, it's all very clear that our world is becoming more dangerous, not less. Many of us in the House have been calling for increased defence spending and to also recognise the symbiotic relationship between our economy and our security. And that's been illustrated by what's been going on in the Red Sea. That's why we need to spend more. But how might we spend it? Could I ask the Minister to consider that we need to look at a defence review, because Ukraine has illustrated, and indeed continues to illustrate, how the character of conflict is changing. And on that note, would he agree that the biggest international security threat is Russia as it moves to a war footing? We've done well to slide across £12 billion of support, but unless more is done, then the tide will turn in Ukraine, and that will change the economy and security of the whole of the continent.
Well, my right friend, as ever, makes some excellent points. And I think he's right actually to mention this point about how we spend it. It's one thing to talk about GDP figures and spend, but what are our priorities? And for me, as procurement minister, something we need to see more of, which I set out in my recent statement on the integrated procurement model, is a much greater use of data, particularly from the front line in Ukraine, to inform our own defence industry so that we can bring forward at a much greater pace those technological innovations, whether in uncrewed systems, in complex weapons, that will truly help strengthen our defence. As to a review, he'll appreciate that's for the Prime Minister and Secretary of State for Defence, but he makes an excellent point.
Nick Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We have the smallest army since the Napoleonic era. So can I press the Minister? Was there a cut of £2.5 billion in cash terms announced in the budget last week?
Well, I hear this point about Napoleon many, many times. Of course, if it is the position of the Labour Party to significantly increase the size of the standing army, that is a massive, massive financial commitment. And yet, to date, he needs to have a word with the Shadow Defence Secretary and the Shadow Chancellor. They haven't once committed to current spending levels, let alone 2.5% when the economic conditions allow.
James Gray.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I strongly support my honourable friend's powerful commitment to defence in general, but I'm rather disappointed by his tepid promise to move to 2.5% of GDP. I also find myself in the career-wrecking position of strongly agreeing with the Shadow Secretary for Defence, who seemed to me to put the arguments extremely well. The fact of the matter is that last week's budget did reduce both kinds of defence expenditure by 2.5%, to 2.5 billion. We are not facing any kind of move towards what no less a figure than the Minister of the Armed Forces last week publicly called for 3%, and two serving government ministers both said how disappointed they are by what the budget said. So by what possible arithmetic does the Minister conclude that we are in fact increasing defence spending when quite blatantly every expert there is in the world says we're not?
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend who always speaks with such expertise on defence matters, of course. I would just make, first of all, in terms of the 2.5% and it being tepid, it will represent, we'd have to be able to sustain that. If it's a one-off, the Army, the Navy and Air Force are not going to be able to plan accordingly. It has to be able to be an investment we can sustain, and thereby the economy of the country has to be able to sustain it. So, and forgive me for sounding like the person in my previous job at the Treasury, but the country does have to be able to afford it, and we do have to be prudent in commitments we make on public expenditure, not least so that they are sustainable in the long term and not a one-off. That would be the worst thing we could do.
Derek Twigg.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister keeps quoting, not talking down our armed forces. We're not talking down our armed forces. They're doing a splendid, brilliant job. What we're doing is running down what the government's doing, which is not enough. Let's put it that way. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, we have the gravest threat we've had since the Cold War. We've got a war in Ukraine. We've got the Middle East in disarray. We've got China increasing spending. Now, can I ask, and the real blame for this, by the way, is the Prime Minister and the Chancellor. So can I ask the Minister, does he think in those circumstances most reasonable people would have thought it was okay not to have put extra resources into the budget for defence?
Yeah. Well, I mean, when the Prime Minister was Chancellor, as he knows, he oversaw the biggest increase in spending since the Cold War. The Chancellor himself, the current Chancellor, has increased spending in the previous budget significantly over the years ahead. We are not cutting defence spending, as I said. If you take the figures in totality, it will rise by 1.8% in real terms, and if we spend what we expect to next year, we will spend 2.3% of GDP on defence and around £55.6 billion.
Sir Bernard Jenkins.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I make a suggestion to my right honourable friend? As it is perfectly clear that both the government, MOD, and the opposition spokesman on defence want to increase defence spending, if we are to take his criticisms at all seriously. Isn't the right question to ask is, are we spending enough to prevent war, not to fight a war? And how much more do we need to spend in order to be an effective deterrent, which we don't appear to be at the moment? Well, I think it's, as I said earlier, I think it's important that we engage in the
key capability questions. It's one thing to talk about spending more. What capabilities would we purchase? Where are our shortcomings? That's why I think it must be a new development at the heart of defence that we have this constant feedback loop of data, integrated warfighting, what's happening in Ukraine, with the armed services, with industry, so that we know what capabilities will make the difference. Just to give one example, we've seen the extraordinary impact of uncrewed weapons in Ukraine. There are technologies that we have had assumptions in our equipment plan about, which are probably far more expensive than those options. I do think we have to look at this from a warfighting point of view, but to support deterrence, the most important thing we can do is back our armed forces, and that's why we have the spending commitment that we do, but it has to be balanced against the ability of the economy to support it and sustain it over the long term.
Tandasi.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Times newspaper recently illustrated that the British Army will shrink in size to 67,000 within the next 2 years due to the current crisis in recruitment and retention. Our senior and close allies, including the US, have expressed their grave concerns, and even senior Conservatives have conceded that our armed forces have been hollowed out since 2010. So, Minister, as threats to the UK increase, why has the government shrunk our army to its smallest size since Napoleon?
Well, the Honourable Gentleman talks about a crisis in recruitment. As I said, in January, we had the highest number of applications to join the Army for 6 years. That's a very important and very positive development. In terms of the size of the armed forces, you can't just talk about the number of soldiers. You have to talk about the amount of accommodation to support them, about the platforms, the weapons, the capabilities. That is an extremely expensive undertaking. Now, he may think that is the right thing to do, but if so, he needs to lobby his own front bench, because at the moment, they haven't committed to spending 2% of GDP on defence, let alone 2.5%.
Mike Forsworth.
Thank you, Ma'am. As a former Armed Forces Minister, I pay high tribute to Her Majesty's Armed Forces, but not to Her Majesty's Treasury. The Red Book, the Budget Bible, shows very clearly in tables 2.1 and 2.2 that the core defence budget next year has been cut by £2.5 billion. That is true. It ill-behoves any government, let alone one which purports to call itself conservative, to then try and use one-off payments to Ukraine or for overspends in the nuclear budget from the consolidated fund and pretend they're part of the defence budget when everyone in this House knows they're not. So I say to the government, if not to the Minister, who I have great regard for, as the son of a D-Day veteran, more in anger than in sorrow, what the government have done is deeply dishonourable, and they should be ashamed of themselves.
Well, my right honourable friend, who was, of course, a defence minister, and I respect his great passion about all things related to the armed forces, particularly because of his father, that when we talk about spending on the nuclear deterrent or spending to support Ukraine, which is purchasing weapons, providing ordnance to them to help ultimately defend ourselves, I do think they are legitimately described as defence expenditure. After all, how else are we to pay for them? From which budget are we supposed to be paying for them? So on that basis, in comparative with last year, it is an increase of 1.8% in real terms, which will amount to £55.6 billion if we spend what we expect to, and 2.3% of GDP.
Kenny McCaskill.
Deputy Speaker, many citizens will be rightly concerned about the use of the phrase pre-war stage, but it's not simply the scale of the British military to come, but where they are currently deployed and what they're operating at the present moment that requires clarification. Are British servicemen firing weaponry in Ukraine, as suggested by German ministerial sources? Are British forces assisting Israel in its genocide through the provision of military intelligence? These are all fundamental to our security and indeed to the UK upholding international law, never mind being a basic democratic right which our citizens are entitled to know.
Well, the Honourable Gentleman knows we don't comment on speculation, particularly in relation to operational matters that are sensitive in relation to our armed forces. That's the right approach, because yes, we have a duty of candour, but we also have to protect those serving on the front line.
Sir Desmond Swain.
Fighting in Ukraine proves that size matters. The Minister should reconstitute the Territorial Army, which demonstrated that with economy, quantity had a quality all of its own.
My honourable friend has a quality all of his own in the way he puts his questions, I must say. It's a very good point. Obviously, we always we tend to talk about the regular army, but we also have to remember our reserves. They are incredibly important. We pay tribute to them as well. I think the point is that what Ukraine has shown is that this country is able to make an extraordinary contribution, because if it hadn't been for the contribution we've made, we can speculate, but it is likely that Ukraine would not have been successful in repelling the Russians as far as it has done.
Andrew Quin.
Thank you. So there we have it. President Putin will be ordering his officers to stop sabre rattling with the West because the British are changing their procurement rules. The reality is the Minister can't fight the war he wants to fight with the capability he's got. He will be presented with the conflict that develops, and we need to have both the capability and the resilience to meet those threats. So what assessment has he made of the threats to the United Kingdom, and how's he going to meet those threats with the armed forces he's got?
Good point. Well, I think his rather trite comment on procurement is a total failure to understand the way the military works. If you want to talk about the deterrent, everything from our nuclear submarines right down to small arms are all part of the procurement system. They have to be procured. My priority is to ensure that we have a procurement system that is agile, that gets equipment as fast as possible to the front line, but also is able to engage with the latest technological developments, because as I said, when we think of lasers, we think of uncrewed systems. Technology is moving at an extraordinary pace. We have used technology as a country to support Ukraine so far. We've provided 4,000 drones. We're going to increase our support to around 10,000. We're doing everything possible to support them. All that is done through the procurement system, and if I may say, highly effectively.
Dunbarton.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I join my right honourable friend in commending the professionalism of our armed forces and indeed pointing out that Labour has not committed to an increase in defence spending. But may I remind him that it's the first duty of any government to ensure that defence spending primarily reflects the threat rather than the ability to pay. We have a war in Europe. We have an increasingly belligerent Russia. I chair the 1922 Defence Backbench Committee. Backbenchers are very much behind the idea that we need to increase defence spending. What does he think, and either government, is going to take to increase defence spending?
Well, I'd say, first of all, we have increased defence spending. The last spending review, crucially, was the largest allocation of spending to defence since the Cold War. Yes, we've set the aspiration of 2.5%, and the answer to that is when the economic conditions allow. I think it would be imprudent to commit to such a level of spending if we didn't think it could be sustained. I think it would be the worst thing to have that spending for maybe 1 year or 2 years and then have to go backwards again because we didn't think it was sustainable. So it is about balancing affordability against commitment, but we need to be absolutely clear. We have at over £50 billion, the most we've ever spent on defence, extraordinary effort in supporting Ukraine, and I do believe highly capable armed forces that, as I've said, are making this extraordinary contribution to NATO and through the latest NATO exercise, and will continue to do so.
Barry Sherman.
Deputy Speaker, I don't want to play to your earlier remarks, but I was born on the night that this House was bombed and this chamber was burnt out. And I asked myself as I listened to the Secretary of State, and I hope he will recall this, that he, as you are aware, he represents the party of Winston Churchill, of Margaret Thatcher. And in this most dangerous world that I can recall in all my years, we are not able to defend this country adequately. On all sides of this House, this is a wake-up call. We must act now.
Well, I pay respect to his longevity and seniority, and to whichever war it was. I think it was the second in which this was bombed on the day he was born. All I would say is, he says we're unable to defend ourselves. I totally and utterly reject that. If Putin had succeeded in his invasion of Ukraine, yes, we would have been looking at a situation similar to the late 1930s. It hasn't succeeded. And the reason it hadn't succeeded because of the involvement of this government taking extraordinary steps to train Ukrainians before the war started, to provide vital munitions like NLAW before the war started, to provide tanks, the first country to do so, and to encourage other nations to provide enormous amounts of arms. Without that, the world would be an even less safe place. But I accept it is becoming more dangerous. That's why we are supporting our armed forces and why we're making such a massive role in NATO in exercise steadfast defender.
Mark Pritchard.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The honourable gentleman for Huddersfield just referenced all sides of the House, but is it not the case there is a very clear distinction between this side of the House and the other side, and that is from the Prime Minister and Chancellor downwards there is a commitment, an agreement to 2.5% spend on defence of GDP, in stark contrast to the party opposite who suggests they're a government in waiting but aren't prepared to commit to 2.5 or even the current spending commitments we currently have. Unity on this side and complete disunity on the other.
Well, I'm a friend who has a constituency with many defence interests, which I had the pleasure to visit recently. It's the nail on the head. We've had all the theatrics, but the fact is we haven't got a clue what they're going to spend on defence. They haven't even confirmed whether they're going to spend the existing 2.3%, let alone 2.5%.
Munira Wilson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The conflict in Ukraine is a stark reminder as to why we must take our defence incredibly seriously. The Minister has just said the world is becoming a more dangerous place. So will he therefore agree that the decision of his government to cut our UK troops to 10,000 was irresponsible? Will he commit to reversing these cuts and ensure that the British Army is the requisite size to defend the United Kingdom and its allies?
Well, as I said, we have just committed 40% of the land force personnel in exercise steadfast defender. NATO is the key to the defence of this nation in conventional terms, and by the way, to the whole continent. And so I think we should recognise the enormous contribution of armed forces, the fact that we have increased spending significantly. But yes, I hear what colleagues are saying, the Secretary of State does. We've set out the case for 2.5%, but I think we also have to reflect we want 2.5% to be sustainable so that the economy can afford it over the long term, and that means through growth and taking sensible measures on fiscal policy.
John Speller.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Minister earlier conceded that funding to Ukraine and the escalating nuclear cost are at the expense of restoring the viability of our frontline readiness. But deterrence is actually a lot cheaper than war. Surely our support for Ukraine and the deterrence should be a charge on the general fund, not to further hollow out our conventional armed forces.
Well, I don't believe I said that point about nuclear. He says it's at the expense of the front line. Nuclear is the front line. We've had CASD patrolling in defence of this country every year since, I think, 1969, as I recall. It's a long time we've had continuous sea deterrent. It's absolutely fundamental to our defence. So the idea that that is not frontline spending is extraordinary.
Yes, it is.
Matt Western.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Looking at the figures for the RDEL and CDEL, it looks like there's a 7% cut, £2.5 billion cut for this coming year. The OBR actually says defence spending is going to be flat as a share of GDP. So will the Minister explain, with Russia's expenditure on its military at 40% of its total economy, why did the Secretary of State accept this reduction from the Chancellor and the Prime Minister?
Yeah, good question.
I think I've explained why we don't believe there's been a reduction. We believe there will be a 1.8% increase in real terms. He says the percentage of GDP is flat. I would just point out in 2019 it was, I think, 2.08%, so just under 2.1%. We believe if we spend everything we expect to in the next financial year, it will be 2.3%. That is a significant increase.
Matters.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm sure as the Procurement Minister he's aware of Survitec in my constituency, which provide equipment to the armed forces and have done for decades. He will acknowledge the importance the last few years have told us about having secure UK supply chains and actually the importance of getting good jobs through the power of procurement to the whole of the country. I would invite him to come and speak to Survitec to hear from them directly about some of the frustrations that they have about the current procurement process.
Well, before I was injured playing football for Parliament versus the Army, I always used to enjoy playing five-a-side with honourable gentlemen. I would be delighted to accept his invitation to visit because actually SMEs and businesses are absolutely critical to this. As the Minister of Defence Procurement and someone who ran an SME, we have got to have an environment in which we can encourage investment in defence, in which we can support our domestic supply chain, and a key part of that is exportability, and I look forward to discussing these matters with his company.
Alistair Strathern.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We know that the shocking state of a lot of army accommodation at the moment is a big driver of some of the recruitment and retention challenges we currently face. So it won't come as a surprise that I'm yet again raising the shocking standard of accommodation at Chicksands Base. When I catch up with serving personnel at our local pub in Shefford over maybe a pint or two, there's a growing sense of resignation about the future of the base, but real concern that its planned closure will mean that their current situation goes unadjusted and that really poor accommodation units aren't improved. To do right by these personnel, will the Minister commit to revisiting the current decision not to upgrade the grade of either of the two service beds that I currently have in my constituency, where hundreds of beds currently fall into grade 3 or 4?
Minister.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. We engaged on this in his Westminster Hall, his Westminster Hall debate on accommodation, and where I announced about our plans in relation to Chicksands. I appreciate that is a matter for engagement in the local community, and that there will be a range of views. I entirely accept that. What I would emphasise to him is he can be clear that we've put an extra £400 million into accommodation, which is seen as to deliver our winter plan highly effectively, a massive increase in the number of properties in the defence estate benefiting from damp and mould packages, but also things like new doors, etc., to deal with some of those long-standing issues in the estate, and I'm keen we want to do more.
And finally, Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Minister very much for his answers to the questions posed to him. There can be no doubt that government must do more to increase defence spending, given that a large portion of our defence has gone to assisting Ukraine, which is correct. But we must ensure that other aspects are not left behind. There was no mention in the budget, unfortunately, last week for an additional increase for our armed forces. Will the Minister commit to ensuring that our actions speak louder than words in terms of increasing our defence budget, and that promises are kept to help our armed forces to keep us safe?
Well, as ever, Madam Deputy Speaker, we save the best till last. The honourable gentleman is always attendant in every urgent question or statement I think I've ever been involved in, and I pay tribute to him for that and the way he represents his constituents, and particularly those who serve in the armed forces from Northern Ireland. They've always been a huge part of our British military story. I've always paid tribute to the contribution, particularly his industry plays. For example, Thales. I had the pleasure to meet a brilliant SME from Northern Ireland supporting the Royal Air Force last week. In terms of spending, I think I've been clear. We had the largest ever increase in defence spending since the Cold War at the last spending review, further funding in the budget thereafter, and a commitment to 2.5% when the economy supports it.
Thank you. That concludes proceedings on the first urgent question, and we now move swiftly. If we could have a quick change, please.